My current job is with Grimshaw the Architects, and with Grimshaw we've got the goal and target of delivering net zero carbon ready designs across all our projects by the end of 2025. And if you don't know Grimshaw, think of the Eden Project in Cornwall, or the redevelopment of London Bridge Station, the Elizabeth Line, or university buildings like the University of Cambridge Engineering Department. So with architects and that challenge of meeting net zero carbon designs, it's really important that we've got access to low carbon construction materials such as steel. So to find out what's happening in the space, we've got Gareth Space, who's the the General Director of Steel UK, Mike De Silva, who's Head of Sustainability at the Clancy Group, and Pat Herman at the BRE Group. And before we get started, I just want to remind you of your contribution that you can make today by asking your questions in the chat box. And towards the end of our session, hopefully we'll have enough time to ask one or two of those questions to the panelists. So before we get started in actually understanding the current status of decarbonisation in steel, we need to really get a sense of the context and how important steel is. So I wonder, Gareth, would you mind just providing that background to us, please?
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. From my point of view, steel enables almost everything within a modern economy. Steel, in that modern economy, everything is either made of steel or made using steel. All net zero technologies use steel, and therefore, from my point of view, representing the steel sector in the UK, steel is the most important material in our economy. And global steel demand currently is a whopping 1.9 billion tonnes of steel. That's 1,900 million tonnes of steel. In the UK, we make 6 million tonnes. Global steel production, as I said, is 1,900 million tonnes. So we are tiny in terms of what we can do or influence the global steel sector. And if you think of steel, for every tonne of steel, there is 2 tonnes, approximately, a bit less actually, 2 tonnes of CO2 produced. So it's a lot of CO2 globally produced from the steel sector. I want to explain that steel travels across borders, it's internationally traded, so more than 40% of all steel produced in the world travels across a border. But what I think is going to be really shocking to all of you is that more than 90% of all steel produced in the world is not subject to a carbon price. The only steel subject to a carbon price is from the UK, the EU, Canada and New Zealand. And there are no plans in all these other regions, really. They say there are, but there aren't really any plans to introduce a carbon price where the most amount of steel in the world is produced. Yet, when I'm at the World Steel Association conference, that is the top topic, not like the top topic and other topics are there. That is literally the only topic they talk about, i.e. net zero steel. But over 90% of steel isn't subject to a carbon price. Demand in the world at the moment is softening, therefore you only make money in steel if you are in a competitive business landscape, a country that provides that competitive business landscape, and you are competitive within those economies. And the final thing I want to say, which I think again is quite shocking, global capacity to make steel is growing. And particularly, I'm not picking on India, but I just want to use the example. In India, steel making capacity will double in the next 15 years. It will become certainly number 2 steel producer in the world after China. China produces more than 50% of the world's steel. India is doubling its steel making capacity in the next 15 years, and the majority of that steel will be produced using the blast furnace method, the integrated steelworks basic oxygen steel. So the high carbon intensive steel that most other economies are trying to move away from. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of how big the sector is and how much we are on that journey to net zero, and how different countries like the UK or China or India are on that journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. I think it would be useful now, really, just to really start to understand what kind of initiatives are out there. What is the response for the steelmakers? And maybe we could bring in Mike here, Mike De Silva from the Clancy Group. What initiatives are you aware of, and what's your take on it?
Great, thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a very interesting landscape, and I think most of you, who are following this will know that the sort of solution that everybody's seeking at the moment to decarbonise steel is really predicated around a thing called directly reduced iron and the use of electric arc furnaces. And again, I don't want to assume that everybody kind of understands the chemistry of this part of the process. So just very quickly to describe it, we need a reductant to essentially take out the carbon from, the oxygen, I should say, from the ore, the iron ore, which is an iron oxide. So typically we've used coal, and it's the carbon in there that acts as the reductant, pulls off the oxygen, and therefore forms CO2, which is released to the atmosphere. If we use directly reduced iron, we have the opportunity to use hydrogen, and again, there are obviously issues currently with where that hydrogen comes from. But if we can move to green and blue hydrogen, we are using the hydrogen then as the reductant, which is pulling that oxygen off the iron ore and producing a byproduct which is water. So I mean, it's just it's a very clean solution thereby. So a lot of work, a lot of research going into that, and then that's followed by the use of the electric arc furnace, which again is, as it suggests, powered by electricity. And if you can green that electricity, again, you have a very low carbon method of steel production. But I think we should also remember that there is still investment in blast furnaces as a route to manufacturing steel, and we don't really see that dropping off considerably in the short to medium term. In fact, there's some evidence that we're actually growing the number of blast furnaces as well globally. So we've got a landscape where we're increasing directly reduced iron, the DRI, currently about 5% globally, predicted to increase by about 3 times in the next 30 years or so. But also there's continued use of blast furnaces. But if we're going to continue to use blast furnaces, the important add-on technology there really is how we utilize carbon capture to deal with those emissions. And again, something that's pretty much in infancy. There is research going on into this technical challenges that need to be overcome in both of those technologies. But there is progress being made in that. I think worth touching on a couple of other things very quickly. One is around, well, what does that mean in terms of planned green steel or low carbon steel projects? In the UK, very little. I think we can probably count the proposed schemes on the fingers easily of one hand. Gareth may have an insight into that. If we look at the European context, we've probably got about, I think, mid-30s in terms of proposed or currently green steel production facilities in sort of trial and piloting stages. Final thing worth mentioning is probably a pull factor to this as well, and in that regard, worth mentioning the Steel Zero initiative, where members who have committed to that are seeking to procure low carbon steel to the tune of about 50% by 2030 on an overall pathway to 100% low carbon steel by 2050. So we've got a bit of a push and a pull there in terms of what's going on.
Just on that push and pull, what about the Responsible Steel initiative? Or maybe Gareth, that's something that you might be able to touch upon, because that's a way where steelmakers are putting out their decarbonisation plans. They're getting their manufacturing sites certified to demonstrate that they are on that journey. Is that not a worthy initiative?
So from my point, I kind of almost want to step slightly, it is a worthy initiative, absolutely, Paul. But if you look at the UK, I mean, we published our net zero roadmap last summer, almost a year ago to the day, of setting out how we in the UK can move to net zero as a steel sector. But there's massive roadblocks, and the roadblocks are, which I just said, is prices set globally for steel. And therefore, if we're uncompetitive, which we are in the UK, and we have been paying 60% more for our electricity than, say, Germany, then you can't make that investment in net zero. So until you work with the government to look at capex, help with capex to make that journey, and OPEX in terms of having a competitive business landscape here in the UK, then we stop our journey right now, not because we want to, it's because we are uncompetitive. We're not making money. And if you're not making
Yeah.
money, you can't make that investment. And if your boards are global looking, there's no steel companies in the UK apart from Sheffield Forge Masters that is owned in the UK, then those international boards will be looking where they can make that investment. And at the moment, why would you make it here in the UK when it's an uncompetitive business landscape, when you're suffering £120 million a year paying carbon costs that your competitors just aren't paying?
That's a good point. Let's bring in Pat now, because I'm just keen. There's a bit of doom and gloom there, really, in terms of added costs because of technology like carbon capture, storage, etc. But Pat, from your perspective, what's out there? What's kind of like driving these whatever decarbonisation initiatives there are? Maybe you could just add to that.
Yeah, on the ground, at the project level, there's an increasing demand for improving the transparency of the carbon impacts of your building, either upfront or often actually over the life cycle. It's coming through from investors in the building itself who now have ESG targets that they have to meet. It's coming through at local and regional policy, GLA. Now you have to do a whole life carbon assessment to get planning. It's coming from BREEAM. Thousands of projects across the world now do life cycle within the materials chapter of BREEAM. And to do this assessment, you need data. You need to know the impacts of the materials that you're putting into your building, and that's measured typically through an environmental product declaration. There's a standardized method for calculating your embodied carbon, as well as a host of other environmental indicators. Standards, EN 15804, fairly niche standard, although it's been around for over 10 years. We, in the last 2 years, I'd say, we've seen the number of EPDs double from sort of 5,000 up to 10,000. In the UK, we have a few hundred, I'd say. Europe's a little bit further ahead, but there's increasing demand for manufacturers now to present their environmental impacts formally and publish it in an environmental product declaration, and something that we're seeing a huge amount of increasing demand for.
So Pat, just thinking, specifically about steel, its manufacturing, the steel products, etc., used in construction. Have you seen an increase there? Would you monitor it? Do you know, how is all parts of the steel supply chain actually responding? And do we have sufficient exposure to EPDs and such like?
It's increasing, alongside all the other sort of building material products, I'd say. Certainly rebar is very transparent. UK Cares, which is the overall sort of UK certification for rebar, it's mandatory to do an EPD to be UK Cares certified, and that feeds into your big projects like HS2, which mandate the use of UK Cares rebar. So a huge amount of transparency there, and a big range and impacts from your sort of electric arc furnace manufacturing in France, where they have a very low carbon grid. They're down at kind of 300 kilograms per ton of steel, all the way up to your blast furnaces in India, China, etc., where they're pushing above 2 tons.
Okay, so Mike, from a contractor's point of view, is that are you getting that visibility? What are you seeing in terms of initiatives or how the steel supply chain is responding to the net zero challenge?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Paul. And I would say that we don't get a huge amount of visibility actually, but we are starting to reach out to our key suppliers to understand what their journey is, what they're doing to if they're either an intermediary, or they are manufacturers, where they are in their journey. And given the context that Gareth has explained in the UK, we're perhaps a bit more limited, but it is a global supply. So, reaching out, finding out if they do have EPDs, or even if they haven't got full EPDs, any carbon related information, then we'd certainly be seeking to do that, and starting to create those demand signals, really. And that's probably something I'll mention more than once before we finish today, but creating those demand signals that we are looking for low carbon products, and we are expecting and seeing our competitors also requesting the same. But I would say we're kind of a bit I guess a bit caught in the middle between our customers, our clients, who want this as a requirement in terms of low carbon steel, but what we can actually achieve, commercially at the end of the day, because of the what is essentially a green premium on some of these products at the current point.
I'd just add
You
something
know,
there that with increasing demand for EPDs comes improved efficiency in producing them. So 5 years ago, an EPD probably cost the best part of 50 grand. Now it's closer to 5, because there's more demand, the tools are more streamlined, and the processes are improved.
could someone just say a few words on the use of scrap steel, and the recyclability of steel, because we're not, part of this is maybe there isn't enough steel to go around of that particular type, but there is in the steel world there's always been a sense of efficiency, hasn't there? Nothing gets wasted. So where are we on that, Gareth? Please.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, so it's an interesting one in terms of scrap, and particularly the UK, because we're in a fantastic position. There is no country in the world that has a greater or more favourable ratio of scrap arisings compared to the amount of steel that we produce. We have more scrap availability in the UK, divided by the amount of steel we produce, than any other country in the world. And so therefore, we talked about, and Mike talked about, different technologies, but if we just looked at moving from the blast furnace route in the UK, say, to the electric arc furnace route in the UK, we have an abundance of scrap. Therefore, actually, if our electricity prices were competitive, then our raw material is here. We don't need to transport it. We can make all the steel we need here for all our needs, and actually make more that we could export away, rather than, which happens at the moment, is we collect all the scrap in the UK, it gets chucked in a very large boat, perhaps gets taken to Bangladesh and is sorted by hand by children in an extreme way. But that should not be the future scenario, given that it can be or will become a critical material, and a critical material that we shouldn't be letting outside of our economy, just leave our economy at low value and coming back as made steel or made products as high value, when that could all be done here in the UK.
So can I ask you, can I just following on from that for 1 minute? I'll bring you in a moment, Mike. Has your organisation or anybody else actually done the mathematics that says actually we can meet the future demands for all our infrastructure renewal, our commercial buildings, or city buildings, using that, being more efficient with the materials that we've actually got within the United Kingdom? Has actually been done?
So we've done a lot of work on scrap. By the end of the summer, we will be producing our very first detailed position on scrap that will have all of what you've just talked about, Paul, in more detail. But even just thinking it off the top of my head, the demand for steel in the UK is 8.9 million tonnes. We make 6 million tonnes. We export probably 40% of that. But crucially, the amount of scrap produced in the UK is about 13 million tonnes. So even without doing the calculation, you realise actually, we are sitting on a gold mine here.
Right. So we need a circular economy for steel. Brilliant. Okay,
Yeah,
Mike, was there something you wanted to?
Yeah,
Is
Paul,
there something you wanted to add?
just quickly to add to that, with my other sort of cares hat on, for which I'm a non-executive director. I mean, one of the great things about reinforcement actually globally is actually a lot of reinforcement, the sort of, I should say, the recycled content of steel in rebar is actually quite high, and has been largely dependent on electric arc furnaces. So I think there's a very good story there. More can be done, and Gareth makes a very good point about the availability and supply of that scrap metal, and where it's going and how it can be best utilised. But the story, for rebar is generally quite good. And again, so if we're using electricity in electric arc furnaces because we're using recycled steel, if we can decarbonise the grid in those countries that are using electric arc furnaces and make that affordable, then I think there's a good success story there.
Yeah, I just want to go one last time to Gareth, actually, because I haven't asked you this question, and then I see some questions coming in from the audience. So just as a reminder, if you have a question, then please put it in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer. Gareth, you gave the global context and what's going on in the UK. You've just talked about the need for more efficiency around recycling and reuse of steel. What else are you currently promoting or you're advocating? What's going on specifically in the UK situation, and are we doing more or less than our European counterparts?
Well, the crucial thing which I've mentioned is the help on capex to transition from, say, in the UK, from blast furnace production to electric arc furnace production of steel. We have six steel making companies in the UK, two of which operate blast furnaces, and the other four electric arc furnaces. And when we look at the capex that's available from governments to make that transition, it's not there at all, really. But if you look at in Europe and in Canada and other parts of the world, governments are stepping up and working with their steel sectors and providing billions, not a few million, providing billions to help with that transition to net zero. And I think what we want to see is more of that in the UK. We have I don't want to knock the government too much in the UK. This government we have at the moment in the last, say, 18 months has done more to help the steel sector than has taken place since the coalition government. So it's good, and we like I said, we've got a Department for Business that's really supporting us, but we need more of that, and we need that to match our competitors. One of our sayings that we say to ministers at the moment is, it's about our competitiveness versus others, and that changes on a daily basis in terms of what other governments are doing. And the one point I want to make, so picking up on Mike when he was talking about rebar, yes, in the UK, if you buy rebar that's made in the UK, it comes from an electric arc furnace route. But if you buy rebar from China, it probably comes from the blast furnace route.
Can I just ask for clarification? Are any other construction material products getting that kind of investment from government, or is it just a case that there isn't money going into this for the whole of the construction materials sector? Very briefly.
So if you're asking Paul, if you're asking me, it's the whole of the steel sector that isn't getting the capex support.
No, I know.
And that capex.
But my question is: are other construction materials getting that investment, or is it the case that no one's getting it?
I would suggest no one is getting it, but
okay, that's fine. No, that's fine. Okay, let's go into the audience questions. We've got 5 minutes or so. They do tie up. First of all, just going back to recycling, is there any examples of recycled steel used in structural frames in the UK? Do we have examples of that? Can we recycle steel for structural purposes
Paul, I'll
or reuse?
I'll answer that in a slightly different context. Again, just and I know these are sort of averaged industry figures, but again, not all steel is necessarily is from virgin material. So inherently, there's quite a lot of recycled steel. In products, I remember work being done by the Waste Research program, RAP, some years
Wrap.
ago. RAP, yeah, took an industry average of about 60% on structural steel was recycled. But I do take Gareth's point that you might buy products from certain countries in the world which are going to have more virgin steel than recycled. But I'm not sure if the question was more looking at the sort of reuse of steel members, within structures. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion around having, proper stamping of components in buildings, and sort of essentially sort of part of this sort of idea of material passports, I guess, to some degree, so that materials can actually be reused from one structure to another. And I think there's certainly a lot more that can be done. And I think moving forward with new structures, we need to look at that. I mean, clearly with historic structures, we haven't had that opportunity, but I think that we should be looking at these things more and more as we go forward.
Definitely, and
There is
particularly if
one
we're
very
designing for
large.
disassembly, we
Yes.
need to have the provenance and the information, the safe testing of
Absolutely.
steel bars and beams and whatever. Can I bring in Pat now, because there's a question from the audience which is around consistent. The question is there a consistent method or standard for steel manufacturers to record carbon produced associated with the production, so that you can get a sense of who's doing better, who's more leaner in terms of carbon output?
Yeah, the standard, as I mentioned, is EN 15884. It's the cradle to grave assessment, starting with raw materials, through to transport, through to manufacturing, energy waste used by the factories. Captures all the impacts, and it's well standardized. It's been around for a few years. There's a subsection of that called product category rules for different types of steel products depending on where they go. So there's one for rebar, and there's another one for structural steel, another one for cladding. So yeah, there's a big framework of standards now. I'd say construction is
Okay, so
a lot.
if people research the EN 1580 and 4, so that's the 15,804. That's what they can look out for. Brilliant. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just go around the room and really get a very brief headline from you as to what should be done now, what could be done to actually improve the decarbonisation of the steel sector in the UK. What would be? Let's start with you, Mike. What would be your main ask?
Yes, Paul. I know you said in the UK. I might leave Gareth to answer that more from a UK specific context, but certainly from a global perspective, and it's relevant to the UK as well. We need to move faster. I think there's some great work being done, but we have a huge challenge on our hands globally, and we need to move faster. I would come back to that pull and push, and again, I said I would mention demand signals again, and here it is again. We need those demand signals from the buyers, and importantly, we need collaboration. We need to collaborate, and we need cheap technology transfer as well. As Gareth pointed out, the UK steel sector is very, very small. What we need to do is share that learning, any learning that we have just in the UK or any other countries, share that technology. And make sure it's going to the countries who are struggling a little bit more. And where we are reliant on countries that are reliant on things like blast furnaces will be for some years more. Again, we need to support them in their decarbonisation with things like carbon capture technology. So doing more collaboration and going faster.
Thank you. That was really short, Mike. Thank you so much. Gareth, be really punchy now. Be quick.
Thank you. So I've been doom and gloom. So let me be upbeat. The last thing I say. So UK government has at the moment an open consultation on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And when that's implemented, and we hope in 2026, the same as Europe, that will mean that all of that steel that I talked about that isn't subject to a carbon price that comes into the UK market will actually be subject to a carbon price. It will be applied at the border, and then we will have a level playing field with our steel that pays a huge carbon price, £120 million a year, will be on par with the stuff that comes in that suffers no carbon price. And that can only be a good thing in terms of what Mike just said about moving things forward.
Okay, so levelling up, that's a nice way to leave today's session. Apologies, Pat, I couldn't get round to, but we are now
Mandate
out of time.
EPDs.
Yes, more EPDs, absolutely. And I'm sure now, I think it's back to the conference chair for some summarising remarks from today's session. So can I just say thank you to the audience for participating and listening and for those questions, but also to our speakers. So we can give you a virtual round of applause. So thank you very much, Gareth, Mike and Pat. Thank you.
Thank you.